So, welcome to the Department of English and Literature and Creative Writing here at the University of Lancaster. We are delighted to be hearing from our colleague, Professor Terry Eagleton. Terry is going to be speaking on humour, so I'll hand over to Terry.
Well, I'm glad to see that John Schad's cynical attempts to sabotage my lecture have not been successful, as usual. He's tried this before, but he never succeeds. Samuel Johnson, always a good way of starting a lecture. Samuel Johnson remarks somewhere that though human beings have been wise in many different ways, they have always laughed in the same way, he says. But surely this is doubtful. I mean, laughter is a language with a host of different idioms: cackling, chortling, grunting, chuckling, shrieking, bellowing, screaming, sniggering, gasping, shouting, braying, yelping, roaring, tittering, hooting, guffawing, snorting, howling, screeching, bellowing, snickering, and so on. What have I missed out? Giggling. Okay. Laughter, in one sense, looked at from one viewpoint, you might say, is a pure enunciation which expresses nothing but itself. But the paradox, I think, is that it's also richly laden with cultural meaning. It's culturally coded, as in the ways I've just listed. In one sense, it lacks intrinsic sense. It's rather like an animal's cry. In fact, Descartes describes laughter as an inarticulate, explosive cry. And not only has it no intrinsic meaning, but at its most riotous and convulsive, it actually involves, of course, the disintegration of meaning as the body tears one's speech to fragments and the id pitches the ego into temporary disarray. As with grief or severe pain or extreme fear or blind rage, truly uproarious laughter involves a loss of physical self-control as the body gets momentarily out of hand and we regress to the uncoordinated state of the infant. Laughter is quite literally a bodily disorder. And since nothing is more fashionable than the body at the moment, that's a point worth making. On the one hand, there's something alarmingly animal about the activity, not least the kind of noise it involves, hooting, braying, cackling, neighing, bellowing. It calls to mind, in that sense, our affinity with the other animals, which is ironic, to be sure, because they don't laugh themselves, or at least not conspicuously so. Though, in fact, a minor footnote to that point, Darwin thought that monkeys chuckle when they're tickled. I don't know if anybody's tickled a monkey recently. I've given up my monkey tickling long ago. But anyway, that's what Darwin argues. So in this sense, laughter is at once animal and distinctively human. It's a miming of the noise of the beasts in one sense, and yet it's quite unbeast-like itself. It signifies in all of the various socially coded ways that I try to indicate, but it also involves the breakdown of signification itself into pure sound, spasm, rhythm, breath, and so on, rather like some surreal symbolist poem. In one sense, then, laughter represents the momentary collapse or disruption of the social order, the sphere of orderly, articulate meaning, while in another sense, it never ceases to assume it because we laugh for a reason. Laughter is a form of utterance which springs straight from the libidinal depths of the body, but there's a cognitive dimension to it as well. Like fury or envy or jealousy, it involves beliefs and assumptions. In fact, all emotions, I think, involve ideas of that kind. They're not simply the opposite of it. Infants smile almost from birth, but laughter begins only around the 3rd or 4th month, perhaps because of its need to engage the mind in some way. It involves ideas at the same time as it disrupts them. It's not all, laughter is not always a laughing matter, mind you. There have even been lethal epidemics of the stuff in China, Africa, Siberia, and elsewhere, mass hysterical paroxysms in which, so it's alleged, thousands of people have died. In 1962, one such outbreak in what was then Tanganyika immobilized whole school districts for months on end, and since being out of control is never entirely gratifying, laughter can easily border on the unpleasant. Again, Johnson defines it in his dictionary as a convulsive merriment, which is, I guess, almost an oxymoron. Same is true, of course, of being tickled, whether you're a monkey or not, with its curious blend of the pleasurable and the unbearable. Lying through his teeth, the narrator of Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy tells us that he once laughed so hard that he broke a blood vessel and lost 4 pints of blood in 2 hours. So there's an example of the unpleasantness of laughter. The Anthony Trollope actually suffered a stroke while laughing at a comic novel, a misfortune by which few of his own readers are likely to be affected. You can, in short, as in the various forms of laughter I listed to begin with, you can treat laughter as a kind of text. You can look for a semiotics of laughter, or as a language with so many regional accents. Upper-class Englishmen, for example, are more likely to bray than middle-class English women, who are more given to tinkling. Military generals tend not to giggle, or popes cackle. Those who play Santa Claus may beam, but they would be ill-advised to snigger. It's hard to imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger simpering, though easy enough to imagine him leering. The president of the World Bank is permitted to laugh heartily, but not hysterically. So all of this apparent physical disintegration and meaninglessness, the pulverizing of sense, is nevertheless socially quite meticulously coded. A good deal of humour involves what Freud calls de-sublimation. We invest a lot of psychical energy in, say, some noble ideal, and these energies are released in the form of laughter when that ideal is rudely or suddenly punctured. Yes, and there's a great deal of this in Irish literature. You might say that one of the constant tropes in Irish writing is debunkery of one kind or another. You know, whether it's the Yahoos against the Houyhnhnms in Swift, or whether it's, I don't know, Leopold Bloom against Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses. It's a recurrent trick or device in Irish writing. Sustaining ideals requires for Freud a degree of psychological strain, and so not having to do so can result in a pleasurable release. We're now free from having to maintain a reputable moral front, and we can express as laughter the economizing on psychical energy, which that freedom involves. Laughter for Freud really is a release of a certain economy. And we can now reap the delectable fruits of being shamelessly crude and cynical, selfish, lecherous, insulting, morally indolent, emotionally anesthetized, and outrageously self-indulgent. But we can also be enjoyably liberated, not only from moral ideals, but from the exigencies of sense-making itself, what Freud calls the compulsion of logic, a process which imposes unwelcome constraints on the anarchic unconscious. The unconscious in that sense is always striving to free itself from the constraints, the straitjacket of our syntax, the constraints of our grammar and discourse. Hence our delight in the surreal and the absurd, in a world in which anything is possible, such as in one of the BBC Radio's Goon shows, the crafty device that they invented during the Second World War of floating a life-size cardboard replica of the British Isles off the British Isles in order to fool German bomber crews during the war. It didn't work, I'm afraid. One psychoanalyst remarks that remaining serious involves successful repression. To be serious is to be repressed. It is, of course, as for many forms of repression for psychoanalysis, a facilitating one. Repression isn't always negative. Without some form of repression, we couldn't be the speaking, living subjects that we are. Without an enormous, shattering repression of much that goes into our making, we couldn't be who we are. We couldn't be subjects at all. So that joking is, as it were, a brief vacation from the mild oppressiveness of everyday meaning. Jokes buck the tyranny of what Freud calls the reality principle. They afford us a certain infantile satisfaction, infants being, of course, what we essentially remain in many ways, as we regress to a condition which predates the jealously enforced divisions and precisions of the symbolic order, which are entirely necessary, and are able to throw logic and congruity and linearity to the winds. So that humour, in this reversion to primal helplessness, humour does for adults, I suppose, in a way what play does for children, namely liberate them for a moment from the despotism of the reality principle and allow the pleasure principle some carefully regulated free play. And if you wanted another analogy, I think it would be art. Art allows the pleasure principle a certain free play, but always within a certain scrupulously regulated economy or order, at least in classical forms of art. Destroying meaninglessness, the pulverizing of meaning, is, among other things, a demonic activity. The demonic is closely associated with a reveling in meaninglessness. One primary form of meaninglessness for human beings is pain. There's something meaningless about pain, however meaningful it may be to a physician. And meaninglessness is demonic in one sense, but it's also something from which, of course, we reap a certain pleasure. Quite a lot of humour springs from things being out of keeping, estranged or momentarily defamiliarized, deprived for a moment of their allotted place in the overall scheme of things. And that's funny, or sometimes when it happens. We laugh when some phenomenon suddenly gets out of place, when things go off the rails or get out of kilter somehow. And that kind of comedy represents a momentary respite from the tyrannical legibility of the world, a realm of lost innocence which predates our calamitous fall into meaning. Our calamitous fall into meaning, which is also, of course, a thrilling and wonderful adventure. The fall, of course, traditionally, theologically, is not a fall down, it's a fall up into history, language, civilization, meaning, and so on. But we're always nostalgic for that which seems to us to predate that, a lost innocence where there's not very much meaning around to oppress us. So it's not surprising, going back to the point, that the demonic is associated with a certain kind of reveling in meaninglessness, a certain sort of obscene pleasure, what Lacan would call jouissance, which is not only pleasure, but obscene kind of pleasure, that hell resounds with the obscene cackling and sniggering and guffawing of those lost souls who believe that they've seen through all human meaning and value and exposed it for the pompous fraud that it is. In what's perhaps the greatest novel about the demonic, about damnation, Thomas Mann, in Dr. Faustus, talks of a Luciferian sardonic mood, a hellish merriment. He's describing hell, a hellish merriment of yelling, screeching, bawling, bleating, howling, piping, the mocking, exultant laughter of the pit. Evil is of course, a kind of vacancy, a sort of nothingness, an inability to be completely alive, an incapacity for life. It's the evil of the living dead in that sense. And the demonic versus the angelic, Milan Kundera, in one of his novels, thinks of the demonic as too little meaning and the angelic too much meaning, like the sort of pretentious language of ideology. Yes, the rhetoric of ideology. It's the demonic against the angelic is Iago against Othello, or Milton's smoulderingly rebellious Satan against his constipated bureaucrat of a deity. Laughter is satanic, writes Charles Baudelaire. It is therefore profoundly human. The devils simply can't suppress a spasm of incredulous laughter at the sheer gullibility of men and women, their pathetic eagerness to believe that their paper-thin meanings and values are as solid as flat irons. Demonic is a form of nihilism or cynicism. But humour can also, of course, be aggressive and insulting. There's a theory of humour, of which Thomas Hobbes is a great exponent, but which dates back to classical antiquity, which is known as the superiority theory. It's a very implausible theory, I think. Well, it's interesting, but the idea that humour always involves getting a laugh out of somebody's misery, a kind of schadenfreude. So humour can be aggressive, insulting. There are jokes which mock women, of course, as in one of them, where God, a woman, is creating the universe. Darkness covered the face of the earth, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God said, "Could I just see the darkness again?" To which a suitable feminist riposte might be, "What do you call the useless bit at the end of the penis?" The man. The Irish quite often savour anti-Irish jokes. What's a Kerryman's foreplay? Brace yourself, Bridget. While Jews are not slow to recount anecdotes against themselves, there was joking in Auschwitz, there was joking in the concentration camps. Good anti-Jewish joke told by Jews. Mr. Goldberg was strolling along a riverbank with his adult son when the son lost his footing and slipped into the water. "Help!" Goldberg shouted. "My son, the lawyer, is drowning." You may have heard that one before. Or the gag about the benefits of dementia, such as the fact that you can get to hide your own Easter eggs. There's also a very fine cartoon, I don't know where from, of a band of old age pensioners on a protest march, holding placards and crying, "What do we want? What do we want?" There are quite a few different theories of humour. I've just touched on one, the superiority humour. The most common by far is the incongruity theory, which I've again mentioned already, which I think remains the most plausible account of why we laugh, though it's by no means a perfect one. There are lots of incongruities which aren't actually funny, which may be quite the opposite, in fact. On this view, however, humour springs from a clash of incongruous aspects, a sudden shift of perspective, an unexpected slippage of meaning, an arresting dissonance or discrepancy, a momentary defamiliarizing of the familiar, and so on. The peekaboo game is really a very early version of this incongruity, where you suddenly replace one appearance with another, which children find funny even when only a few months old. In fact, I was playing this game with my son only recently, and he was really cracking up, and he's actually 24. So there we are. So some sort of establishment of one perspective or framework or meaning, and then the taking of it away. As in the joke, "You've got to stop masturbating," a doctor tells his patient. "Why?" asks the patient. "Because I'm trying to conduct a medical examination," replies the doctor. This relies on a certain incongruity as we slip without warning from one frame of reference, masturbating in general, to another, masturbating here and now, or how come there's only one monopolist commission? It plays on the apparent self-contradiction. There's a similar slippage of framework in the story of a visitor being shown by a guide around a Moscow art gallery and pausing before a painting entitled Lenin in St. Petersburg. Inspecting the canvas more closely, the visitor can see only a portrait of Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, in bed with a handsome young man. But where is Lenin? Asks the visitor bemusedly, to which the guide replies, Lenin is in St. Petersburg. So a quick slide of meaning, a quick shift of viewpoint or sudden balking of expectations, I think, it belongs with the incongruity theory of humour. Think of Dorothy Parker's retort in being told that revellers at Halloween duck for apples. There, but for a single continent, is the story of my life. Holding out a meaning and then snatching it away. Or two divergent meanings colliding in an economy of difference and identity, like the old hairy old joke, have you read Marx? Only where I sit down. If the ego invests in unity and identity, univocity, the id is enamoured of fragments, nonsense, part objects, multiplicities, non-identities. Postmodernism sometimes foolishly, in a binary opposition they're supposedly opposed to, celebrates the latter and demonizes the former. You couldn't have any social life without the ego, without the absolute importance of the ego. But you might say that a joke occurs, Freud says more or less this, a joke occurs when the ego dips for a moment into this outlandish element of the id. It's the nature of the reality principle to keep the mind focused by thrusting other possibilities at arm's length. Otherwise we couldn't speak at all. We couldn't speak if the grammar of our speaking was simultaneously present to us. But it's the nature of humour to allow some of these other possibilities to swarm in. So the disruption of expectation, sometimes by a single word, is the familiar form of incongruity. Oscar Wilde does it pretty often. Nothing succeeds like excess, for example, or his complaints that I live in constant fear of not being misunderstood. The young people of today have no respect for dyed hair. There's another Wildean shaft where all is pitched on a single epithet, dyed rather than grey. As we know, a Freudian slip is when you say one thing and mean another. The fin de siècle poet Ernest Dowson, who used to frequent rather shady dives in Soho, once declared that absinthe makes the tart grow fonder. And the famously intoxicated playwright Brendan Behan described himself as a drinker with a writing problem. In all of these cases, the sense of a word or phrase is comically askew to the one that we're geared up to expect. Language is in and out of place at the same time as we're forced to hold a conventional meaning in tension with a sudden semantic twist. Or another of Dorothy Parker's cracks, the boat crossing was so rough that the only thing I could keep on my stomach was the first mate. Right, now, Cicero remarks in his treatise on oratory, another excellent way to begin a sentence, that the most common kind of joke is indeed, he's seen this already, the kind where one thing is expected and another is actually said. It's through this small rupture in logic, as it were, that laughter can come welling up. Even a minor change of punctuation can comically deflect an intended meaning, as in the famous comment made by a BBC radio cricket commentator, the batsman's holding, the bowler's willy. There should be a comma after holding, which is the name of the batsman. Anyway, I won't explicate that. What I guess the argument is there, the way the argument goes, is that humour happens for the most part, for the incongruity theory, at least, when some fleeting disruption of a well-ordered world of meaning loosens the grip of the reality principle. And that means that we can, for a moment, relax our psychical investments in reality in a way that's then expressed in laughter. Laughter, on this theory, is the release of a certain psychical energy which is momentarily no longer needed. For a moment, the ego is able to relinquish its insistence on congruence, coherence, consistency, linearity, and so on. It ceases to fend off unwanted meanings, unconscious associations, and it allows us to revel in a playful diversifying of sense so that we economize on the psychic energy we need to repress these things and release it in the form of laughter. And there are obvious similarities or resonances, I hope, in what I'm saying about humour there with say, poetry. Yeah. Oh yes, I was going to go on and talk about wit, but I think if I do, I'm going to be led to talk for quite a long time. So it may be best for me, since we're just on the half hour, to stop at that point and to ask for your various jokes, slices of wit, comments, and so on.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much. And so, yeah, if you have, please, any questions, or as Terry says, any excellent jokes, then please do share either with us, either via the chat or by raising your hand electronically, and we can bring you in. That would be lovely. And while you're brooding and thinking, let me ask Terry, yeah, poetry and then humour. You mentioned just in passing there toward the end that there are similarities in terms of perhaps disjunction and deflation and disruption of expectation and so on and so on. We would conventionally think of the poetry, therefore, as to do with the beautiful, perhaps, as a sort of default, and humour, but humour not. So what, is there an aesthetic in humour? Is there a beauty in humour at all?
Yeah.
Or always, or never, or?
Yeah, if you push the beautiful too far, John, I mean, of course, the beauty has a central place in aesthetics, but if you push it too far, you get something like, as I was describing, Kundera's notion of the angelic. That's to say, it's very bland and boring. You need, as it were, a little spice or touch of the demonic, some minor disruption, you know, in order to make it more interesting. And there one might think of the sublime, you know, the other 18th century aesthetic term that goes with the beautiful, which is indeed beautiful, but also terrifying, dramatic, you know, which disrupts you at the same time as it elevates you, full of all kinds of contradictions. Yes, the other point there about poetry and beauty, John, is that I suppose we can almost pinpoint the dates, the period when poetry is allowed to be ugly. And I think it isn't it with Baudelaire. It's with Baudelaire and Rimbaud. It was from Baudelaire, so T.S. Eliot tells us, that he learnt how poetry could be, and sometimes needed to be, not necessarily ugly, but mundane, prosaic, even sordid. Yes, I mean, that's typical of what we would call a modernist aesthetic, isn't it? And it may be that beauty becomes increasingly implausible as an ideal with the birth of industrial capitalism, because industrial capitalism is a bit unlovely. The more the environment becomes contaminated by that, the less ideals of beauty in aesthetics are really able to hang on. And eventually, with, as it were, the modernist revolution, beauty, now even beauty will be interrogated by a certain salutary ugliness, or at least deflation of it.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Yes, very. Thank you. Please do tap in the bar or raise a hand. Otherwise, you'll have to be put up with my questions. Terry, what do you find funny? What comedians or schools of comedy, etc. What? Yes. Who or what do you find most funny?
Well, I think it would be hard to beat Billy Connolly and Eddie Izzard. I think, and I would feel so. I think, although while Connolly is in a sense hilarious, but in some way predictable, I find Izzard's humour extremely interesting. It's with a very, very weird fantasizing. One of the characteristics of a lot of famous English, well-known English humorists, I mean, really all the way from, say, Tony Hancock to maybe Morecambe and Wise, Kenneth Williams, certainly, one or two others, is the way that they, to go back to this idea of debunkery and deflation, the way they combine a certain pretentiousness on the one hand, with a sudden swoop into the ordinary on the other. That's very English. It's as though they represent, the patrician and the plebeian in the same body. They're together. That contradiction that lies so closely to the centre of English culture. It's not the same as Irish debunkery, which is a different matter. Irish debunkery, I think, arises in part from the fact that in Ireland you have a very high tradition of scholastic and monastic culture in a very barren and bleak and harsh social conditions, and it's the oscillating from the one to the other which creates the humour or the irony or the black humour. Irish humour, of course, like Jewish humour, is notoriously black. It always keeps death and breakdown in mind. Think of Beckett. Beckett is Irish in all kinds of ways. One way which is very Irish is his brand of humour, which has nothing of the appallingly hearty, good, clean fun, Boy Scout, locker room conception of humour that one finds more in the Anglo-Saxon world.
Thank you. Phoenix, please do either tap in your question or just turn on your mic and or camera.
Hello?
Hi.
Hello.
We can hear you.
I was just wondering, what about visual comedy? Does that work in the same way? Written or spoken?
Yes, it's true. Sorry, it's true. I have maybe concentrated unduly on verbal comedy there in what I said, but I think quite a bit of it maybe applies to visual comedy as well. It's interesting to think about farce, actually, when one thinks of the physical or visual aspects of humour. Farce is almost action stripped of meaning. I mean, if you watched parts of King Lear on television with the volume turned right down, you might well mistake it for a farce. And there are, of course, farcical elements in King Lear. Yes, I think the sense, certainly the incongruity can happen at a visual level. What's less certain, perhaps, is the superiority theory of humour, which is very much based upon a verbal idea of it. Perhaps that's not quite so obvious, visually speaking, but a greater deal of humour combines the two, doesn't it? The verbal and the visual.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Phoenix. Please just tap in your questions as Keith's just done. So Keith Claxton, as language as it appears at the moment becomes policed more carefully, will humour risk shrivelling away?
I shouldn't think so. I mean, I'm not a clairvoyant, but I don't think so. If humour can survive in the conditions of Auschwitz, it can survive anywhere, I would have thought. I see what you mean. The policing of language as, say, in political correctness, yes. But it's also, if one's speaking politically, humour and politics, it's not clear. I mean, you can argue a sort of subversive case for humour. Many people have. Much of what I've been saying about debunkery and so on is really about subversion. On the other hand, if humour is a kind of harmless blow-off, it releases energies which might be used otherwise, it may be a conservative device. I mean, I think humour in different contexts is one or the other. Carnival in the wake of Bakhtin is often celebrated on the left, isn't it, as a great, cacophonous riot of the physical and libidinal and all those other things that the left likes. But they tend to forget that, of course, Carnival too is a scrupulously policed affair. It happens only so often. It's an allowable release. It's a socially sanctioned relief. It's part of the calendar. It's written in. Olivia in Twelfth Night says there's no harm in a licensed fool. The licensed fool is very important. The fool who has the right to insult the monarch. Insulting the monarch can be narrowed and contained within the figure of the fool itself. So the question, I think there's a question underlying the question that Keith raised about the politics of humour, which are a lot more ambiguous, I think, than people on either side of the fence sometimes imagine.
Thank you. The question here from Alex, one of our second-year undergraduates. Thank you for the lecture. I was wondering if Terry had any thoughts of laughter as the only truly universal language. I attended a lecture several years ago which discussed this, saying that even smiling or other emotional expressions are not culturally universal, but laughter is.
Yes, that takes us back to Sam Johnson, doesn't it? That we all laugh in the same way. No, I don't think that's true, as I try to argue. There are different idioms of laughter, different socially coded kinds of laughter. But yes, laughter as such, I think, is probably a universal, just as grief or lamentation are the expressions of those, of course, vary culturally. But culturalists, cultural relativists tend to forget that what's varying culturally is very often something which all or many societies share. I think there are certain universals of that kind, and although humour, in one sense, humour is very culturally specific. Certain cultures don't really understand the humour of others. Nevertheless, humour of some kind, joking of some kind, think of so-called joking relationships in some pre-modern tribal societies in which, a father-in-law has to have a joking relationship with his son-in-law or whatever it is. I think those certainly are global. As for not smiling, men tend not to smile, I think, as much as women do. And also, I think, although I'll probably be accused here of stereotyping, I think it's very interesting that when one meets a Scot, particularly a Scottish man, they don't normally smile. Smiling is just not acceptable or just not habitual as part of the process of meeting, encountering somebody. That's not to say they have no sense of humour or whatever. Speaking incidentally of stereotypes, I may be the only person left on the planet, I probably am, who thinks that they have some point. Very unfashionable, unpopular thing to say. But first of all, note that stereotypes are by no means always negative. There's some very positive stereotypes, but also, even if one still objects, even to positive stereotypes, it would seem to me incredible to believe that a number of people could live materially and physically together over long stretches of time, sharing various kinds of habits and institutions without developing certain psychological features in common. That would seem to me a totally non-materialist case. And yet it's argued almost every day by postmodernists of one kind or another. Yes, it reduces to the banality, the American banality in particular, everybody's special. Does that mean nobody at all is shaped and influenced by the culture around them? Yes. So I would put in a lonely, probably the last plea you'll ever hear on this earth for stereotypes. They do sometimes have their uses.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Alex. Dolly is typing in a question. It's still not coming through, Dolly, for some reason or other. Would you like just to articulate it using old-fashioned voice?
That what role did humor play? I mean, how did the audience receive or react to the humor that was deployed in the Elizabethan and Jacobin tragedy, like Dr. Foster's, Duchess of Malfi, and so on?
I only caught the end of that, Dolly. Could you just say the first bit again?
Yeah, I'm saying that I was wondering that how did audience, the audience of in the Elizabethan England or in the Jacobean age, kind of receive or perhaps saw the humor that was deployed in the Elizabethan and Jacobin tragedies. For example, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the coexistence of, as it were, the major tragic, the grand tragic action and the low-level humorous or farcical subplot is something like the sort of deflation technique I was talking about, isn't it? Except that the low-level subplot isn't intended exactly to debunk or deflate, the higher, the tragic plot, but to provide a different kind of mode. And one of the striking aspects of Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre, that's to say, the greatest theatre that Britain has ever produced, is the coexistence of incongruous modes. That the Jacobean playwrights in particular are so loosened up, the forms are so loosened up, that they're able to take on a whole bunch of genres and forms. Insert Gothic horror scenes into an entirely different kind of plot without this seeming particularly incongruous in the negative sense of the word. By the time you get to the end of the 17th century, the end of the same century, and you get to Restoration comedy and tragedy, that will have disappeared. There's a rather alarming homogeneity about typical Restoration comedy or tragedy, which reflects, of course, a social narrowing of the audience. You're now not playing to groundlings anymore. You're playing to people who've paid quite a lot of money, and many of whom are probably gentry and aristocrats and merchants and so on. So the fascinating development of theatre over the 17th century, as it becomes less diffuse, less multiple in a certain sense, and more uniform.
Thank you, Dolly and Terry. Is humour so utterly social that you probably didn't go there at all, actually? But when we listened to you having to tell your gags, many of which I was chortling away at, but you couldn't hear that because I have a mic off. You were telling jokes, as it were, almost to no one. Can one tell oneself a joke? Tickle yourself, I suppose.
Yes. The psychologist Adam Phillips points out that you can't tickle yourself. I can't remember why he thinks that, actually, John, but I suppose it's true. Your tickling requires a certain otherness, doesn't it? A certain invasion, maybe a pleasurable, partly pleasurable invasion of somebody else. Speaking of, I'm very glad to hear you chortle some of the gags, John, because it is a terrifying experience, to deliver jokes to a machine with absolutely no response. It's like really dying on stage. absolutely corpsing, as they say in the profession. No form, hardly any verbal form, depends more upon reciprocity and response than humour. You know, you joke to make somebody laugh. You joke to elicit, to provoke a response. And if you don't, then if you've got any sense, you stop. But what I had to do just now was, you know, for half an hour, terrifying, talking, you know, telling a few gags to this very, very tight-lipped screen in front of me.
Yes, we'll do it again for it to you. Yes, if you tell yourself, I do tell myself jokes occasionally, and I suppose what would be terrifying would be if I didn't find it funny. If I failed to make myself laugh, wouldn't it?
Yes. Oh, you do make yourself laugh, John.
We do, don't we? We sort of.
Oh, that's good. I suppose. Yeah, yeah.
But what if you fail? Yeah. Dolly, do speak if you want. Terry first.
Oh, go ahead.
Dolly, did you want to come in?
Yes, yeah. I was just wondering that Aristotle's Poetics, you know, like he defines tragedy as a serious action, and which something that needs to, you know, deploy scenes that bring about catharsis in the audience. So, like, so by, you know, including this humorous scenes and farcical comedies in their plays, did the Elizabethan and Jacobean dramatists kind of challenged Aristotle? Although in Johnson's preface on Shakespeare,
Yes, I think they did. I don't know. I mean, how conscious that was. But certainly, Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre challenges Aristotle, and so it should. I mean, far too much, in my view, has been made of that dry little thesis by Aristotle on poetics. We don't, where he hardly mentions the fact that tragedy is concerned with sorrow. It's a very formalistic approach to tragedy, and some classicists argue already out of date by its time. Catharsis is a concept that's nobody really, I mean, it's a very contested concept, isn't it? Nobody quite knows what Aristotle means by catharsis, but certainly a lot of what I was saying about humour would apply there, wouldn't it? If it is some kind of pleasurable release, then humour, well, would seem to us perhaps a more obvious candidate for catharsis than tragedy. Again, a lot of Aristotle has been misunderstood, I think. Not only has I think it been overrated, but this is not relevant to what you're saying, Dolly, but I mean, when Aristotle famously talks about the tragic flaw, and then people start looking at Shakespearean characters and saying, what's his flaw? What's her flaw? That's a complete misunderstanding of Aristotle. Aristotle didn't think in terms of individual psychology. That's a modern way of thinking. He meant by flaw, the word for flaw in that treatise Hamartia means something like, well, translate it rather crudely into our language, something like cock up. It means some blunder in the action itself, not some moral or psychological defect or deficiency in the individuals. Aristotle is not interested in individual characters. He says at one point, the character is just the bearer of the action. Tragedy for Aristotle centers on the action and not on the individuals.
Thank you, Dolly. Thank you, Terry. A question here from Fernando. Terry's observed that humour is basically demonic. I take it the reason is angelic. So I wonder what is Terry's take on the common wisdom that Jesus is never portrayed laughing, smiling, or telling jokes in the Gospels. And in a broader sense, the question is whether there is room for humour in the Scriptures or even in heaven.
Yes. Excellent question. I don't think I said, or at least I didn't mean to say, that all humour is demonic. Demonic humour is of the kind that revels, sometimes in a rather obscenely self-indulgent way, in the breaking of meaning. Yes. Luciferian yelping and piping and so on. I think there are other forms of humour that are, as it were, more angelic, and much humour involves both. The sphere of meaning. As I said before, emotions have, in some sense, to engage meaning. If you're jealous, you have to be jealous because you know what you're jealous about, or you think you do. So I don't want to clean a distinction there between, the ego and the unconscious, or feeling and reason. As for the gospel, it is true, isn't it, that Jesus isn't the greatest laugh in the world. It's certainly not a giggle a moment. Maybe he was, of course. The gospel is no doubt a highly selective account of what he was, and it's not. It's very strikingly, the gospel is not interested in portraying Jesus as a character. As I was saying about Aristotle, the ancient world were not interested in that sort of, deep individual psychology, which is a very modern idea. We don't even get to know what he looked like. That's not relevant. One reason why I think there isn't much sense of humour in Jesus, there is a lot of play in the sense that and pleasure in the sense that the disciples are accused of being gluttons and drunkards, and they don't do any work. Jesus doesn't do any work at all. He just wanders around the place. In that, he's like his father, who stopped working on the sixth day of creation and then just rested ever since. God hasn't done a stroke ever since the sixth day of creation. Would you believe it? What would a Tory government say about that? But one reason, I think, for that presentation in the gospel is because one of the dominant tones of the gospel, I think, is urgency, absolute urgency. The kingdom of heaven is upon you even before you know it, and unless you change your ways, then it's going to be pretty awful. As for humour in heaven, most certainly. I think that as a theological friend of mine wrote, if God is love, then that must include an infinite sense of humour. And he needs it. There's no doubt about it at all. Looking down from heaven, he sure needs it. That self-delight, which is the deity, that infinite, inexhaustible abyss of self-delight and jouissance and ecstasy, must be very akin to humour, though it's not verbalized as such.
Thank you. What fails to make you laugh, Terry? Are there any famous comedians or comic films, whatever, that fail to make you laugh, and do you know why?
Yeah, I think one comic who fails to make me laugh is Boris Johnson, actually. However hard he tries, however much of a buffoon and a farceur he is, he just doesn't move me at all. I don't know why that is. Somehow doesn't. Yes, I don't find the Marx Brothers very funny, John. I think a lot of classical humour changes very rapidly historically, doesn't it? So if we just look back at old movies, it's hard sometimes to think they could ever have been thought funny. So it has that kind of historical relativity. Yeah.
The Boris Johnson case is very interesting, isn't it? Because you obviously hear someone who's doing the deflationary, but
Yes.
arguably very different political ends. What do you have? It is an unusual manoeuvre, isn't it? I think.
He's the two in the one body, isn't he? He's
right.
On the one hand power, and the apparent frivolousness about power, which he also projects, which of course, in one sense, is a way of confirming that power. For power to be, people on the left often don't realize that one of the ways that power can stay in power, as it were, is by being ironic about itself. It just isn't true, it seems to me, that all dominant ideology or all dominant authority survives simply by its seriousness. By apparently relaxing and joking about itself and being ironic, it can actually reinforce its authority.